pyramid? Is it going to be straight up? Things like that engineers have to think about. But in our class today, we wouldn't have to think about that. But in our continuing account of Genesis, we're going to encounter some tower builders who thought their tower was special, until God came along to put everything in its proper perspective. So we're going to learn about how God showed his sovereignty over rebellious humanity. And that happened then, and it's still true today, isn't it? We are rebellious practically every day in our lives. And I go to bed every night apologizing and asking for forgiveness of my rebellion during the day. So, pictures aren't very big. But look at those slides. It's not obvious or quickly apparent what they have in common. Is anybody willing to give it a shot? You kind of have to know your history, and you have to know a lot of... what's that?
Concrete.
Okay, yeah, there's some built with concrete. Woodchester Mansion is pretty old. I don't know if that was. And I'm telling you, guys aren't going to get this, but it's fun to hear answers. So concrete. The truth of the matter is that all three of these structures were uncompleted. Now, the one on the top left, you think, well, that looks pretty completed. Well, that's the Woodchester Mansion. Turns out the owner was such a perfectionist and made so many changes in the process of this construction. This was in the 1800s, that it ended up not being finished because they ran out of money. So the outside might look nice, but I have no idea what the inside looks like. The next one is the Cincinnati subway. Now, I've never been to Cincinnati. Do they have a subway right now? I don't know. But this subway was started before the Great Depression. Great Depression hit, they ran out of money, so they stopped building the subway. So that's a picture of one of the tunnels they never finished. The bottom one looks horrible, but that's actually the most recent. That is the Marble Hill Nuclear Power Plant. The Public Service Company of Indiana started construction of this power plant in 1977. By 1984, the project was abandoned after they failed to secure funding to complete the project. Due to construction mismanagement, regulatory scrutiny, and mishap on 3 Mile Island, that might have had something to do with it. In 1979, the project was canceled after spending $2.5 billion. It was supposed to cost $700 million. What a colossal waste of money. What about unfinished projects? Do you guys have any around your houses that you're willing to share? What's your project? You have some? I have chairs that are in my garage right now, and they're such an eyesore, and they take up so much space. And I've been working on that project forever. So it's unfinished. Now, in my wife's mind, that project is probably unfinished a year later, longer than I think it has been, because she's wanted it to have been done for a long time. But the weather, other projects always seem to get in the way. So I've got a lot myself. So, what's that?
The weather.
The weather, yeah, always gets in the way. Well, that's what we're going to look at today, is a big unfinished project. Now, given what we've talked about, what is the project that's unfinished? Tower of Babel, right. So the project was an ambitious project. It was eventually abandoned, not because of perfectionism or shortfall in funding. The unfinished project would be a testimony to the sovereignty of God. So if you look at Genesis 11, open up your Bible. Now I'm going to point this out before we technically start our lesson, because in our book we've got the 40,000-foot view. It's just a survey. And there's some important things about the Tower of Babel that I think we should know. So, was it last week or the week before? Remember we talked about the Noah's Ark and how they think they may have found it? There's a picture of it. And they've got it broken down for the timbering, the levels, all that kind of stuff. Does anybody remember where that is found? in the mountains of Ararat. I don't know if it's Mount Ararat, but yeah, they say it's in Turkey. So I want you guys to know, and there's a reason I'm telling you this, many archaeologists and researchers have concluded that the ark has been found right here. Many Christian scholars believe this cannot be Noah's Ark. So turn to Genesis 11:2. As you're looking there, it says, "And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there." Are you guys pretty proficient with your Middle East geography? So what direction did they travel from? From the east. They traveled from the east. If you look at a map of the Middle East, you can't really see the circles very well, but the mountains of Ararat are right there. Where's Babylon? Right there. So the mountains of Ararat are considerably north and west of the plains of Shinar, where Babylon was founded. Right? So the mountains, how is it possible that this structure in Turkey is the remains of Noah's Ark if the people came from the east? Now, I'm not dogmatic on this. It could be that the people got out of the ark, wandered around a while, and came over here and then came back. That's possible. But we know that the ark, if you're standing on the plains of Shinar at Babylon, when you look east, you're not looking at Turkey, you're looking at Iran, right? Or maybe even farther east. So the reason I wanted to bring that up is that many scholars believe the ark rests in the mountains of Iran. And interestingly, the settlers of Iran were Elam, the Elamites. And the term Elam means high. Could it be the high people from the high mountains of Iran? So I just wanted to make a point, is we don't want to get hung up on the ark being in Turkey. And why do I say that? There may come a time, and it's already happened, but people already challenge the Bible as being false, right? A false narrative of history, a false everything. I don't want you guys to get hung up on the fact that if we're going to claim that's the ark, people may challenge you and say, well, they came from the east, so your Bible is wrong.
My Bible doesn't say they came from the east. It says they moved eastward.
Mine also says that.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
It says as the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there.
What version do you have?
NIV.
NIV?
I have New American Standard.
New American Standard? Okay. So there is obviously some speculation then in the translation, but in the King James and the New King James Version, it says they came from the east. So I just want you guys to be aware of that, okay? Don't let somebody convince you that your Bible isn't truthful or correct. That's the reason why I brought that up. Another thing I wanted to bring up is, do you believe that God has a sense of humor? I do. I believe God, the Holy Spirit, uses puns and everything else. One thing the Bible, the book doesn't talk about, but I wish it did, is the Tower of Babel. We call it the Tower of Babel. Have you ever heard it called the Tower of Babel? So Babel in Hebrew means tower to heaven. Babel also means confusion. There's two things going on here, and the same word is used to describe both, a tower to heaven and confusion. So I enjoy the puns that I see in the Bible, so I see that as a pun. But thought I would throw that out there. I don't know what you do with that, but I think it's funny. Okay, one of the things we're going to be looking at today is the formation of the nations in Genesis, called the Table of Nations. The genealogy is in Genesis 10, And it might seem unimportant to the casual reader, but the information in it helps us to understand the major groups of people that formed after the flood. In fact, some of the names listed in the Table of Nations can be traced to people groups at the time of Israel's occupation of the Promised Land and even today. It's an interesting study that you find a lot of information about the Table of Nations. It might be a study for you to do on your own time. We don't have time for that. But it's an interesting thing about how the Bible covers genealogies, in that the genealogy of the non-elect is always placed before the chosen line. So what do I mean by that? Genesis 10 is wholly devoted to the genealogy of the sons of Noah. Japheth is covered in the first 2 through 5 verses. Ham is covered from verses 6 to 20, and Shem is covered in verse 21 and 32. That listing is a genealogy of the Table of Nations. Who is the name listed last in Genesis 10? It's going to be Shem. Shem is a name listed last. It's interesting in the Bible that genealogies always start with the non-elect and move to the elect. We know that Christ came through the line of Shem. Shem is the elect line, the selected line that the Messiah would come through. We see that throughout the Bible. In Genesis 4 and 5, Cain was selected before, Cain came before, the description of Cain came before the description of Seth. In Genesis 25, Ishmael, the description of Ishmael came before the description of Isaac. And in Genesis 36 and 37, we'll see that Esau's description comes before Jacob. So if you're wondering who is the select line in a genealogy you read, it's going to be the last one typically mentioned. Once again, I don't know what you do with that, but that's how the Bible is laid out. So moving on to our outline, we're going to talk about the formation of nations, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. So here on this slide, we see Noah's 3 sons, and we'll start with Japheth. Japheth had 7 sons. I think I've got that right there. There you go. Japheth had 7 sons and 7 grandsons. They settled mainly in the north, in modern Turkey, as well as the west and the south of the Caspian Sea. So when you think of the Europeans, those are from the line of Japheth. Most of us would probably come from the line of Japheth. Madai, the son of Japheth, is the one from whom the Medes descended. In 10:2, they settled in what is now called Persia. The Greeks are descendants of the sons of Javan. Historically, the descendants of Japheth did not cross paths with the nation of Israel, but they are mentioned in prophecy in Ezekiel 27, 38, and 39. Do you remember who's mentioned in Ezekiel 37 and 38, or 39, or through 39? Gomer. So if you look at the line of Japheth, Gomer, we get Magog, so the Magog invasion. So we don't typically see Japheth, the line of Japheth, interacting with Israel, but we do in some places. The descendants of Ham, verses 6 through 20, form the eastern and southern peoples of Mesopotamia, the Cushites. Descendants of Cush, the oldest of the sons, settled in South Arabia and in present-day southern Egypt, Sudan, and northern Ethiopia. The queen of Sheba, she was a Cushite. And if you remember her, she visited King Solomon. They became mingled with the Semitic tribes dwelling in the same region. Hence is the repetition of some of the names in the other lines. So some of the Hamites and the Shemites kind of intermingled and lived together in some of the same areas. Nimrod. Nimrod was a son of Cush. So he was a descendant of Ham. Interestingly, do you guys remember from the 3 sons, which 2 were blessed and which one was cursed by Noah? Ham was cursed. And it's through the line of Ham we see the rise of Babylon, the Tower of Babel. So we see some bad things coming from the line of Ham. So the Table of Nations takes a break in Genesis here. I don't know how much time we'll get to spend in that to give a further description of what Nimrod was like. He is described as both a mighty one on the earth and a mighty hunter. These titles suggest that Nimrod was both a skilled hunter and an influential leader. I don't know if you guys know your history, but many Bible scholars believe that Nimrod became a giant somehow. If you look at Nimrod, you'll see that he began to become a Gibberine, which was one of the giant clans. We don't know how that happened, but he became something he wasn't formally. But what's interesting about that is we have a lot of history from, we've got myths from the Romans, from the Greeks. They're the same characters, just different names, right? Well, I don't know if you know this, but Nimrod is commonly thought to be Gilgamesh. You guys ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh was a giant. So it's funny how all of that kind of interplays together. So Nimrod's name means let us rebel or just rebel. And some speculate that his name is a reflection of Cush's attitude towards the curse of God put on the father of his family, Ham. Perhaps Cush even trained his son to lead a rebellion against God to try to thwart God's plan on his descendants. We don't know. That's what some scholars believe. Alexander Hislop, in his book, The Two Babylons, gives the background of how Nimrod was responsible for the Tower of Babel. If Nimrod, who attempted to bring together the human race after the flood in an effort to get them united into a nation of which he could become the great world leader. He was a rebel. He founded the city of Babylon. And of course, the city of Babylon is the source of all pagan religions. So he was a rebel from the start, founder of Babel, the hunter of the souls of men. He was the lawless one, and he is a shadow or a type of the last ruled ruler, the Antichrist, who is yet to appear. When does he appear? After we're gone, right? Right. So he'll appear after we're gone. So the first great civilization, therefore, came out of the sons of Ham. So what kind of arrogance do you think might have existed among the people, or especially Nimrod, to think that he could keep in mind when they left the ark, what did God tell them to do? Spread out. What kind of arrogance do you think it took for these people to stay and decide, we're going to stay right here, and here's what we're going to do? What do you guys think about that kind of level of arrogance?
That same arrogance going on in today's world.
I was just going to say that. We look at the Tower of Babel, that's such a dramatic event, it's easy to point out the arrogance. What about in our own lives? How often do we decide, I'm going to do this, or I want to do this today? Oftentimes we commit sins because we were tempted, we were weak, but how many times do we commit sins intentionally with the idea that God will forgive me? Same kind of arrogance, I think, speaks in our own hearts that we saw there. So Mizraim, the second oldest son of Ham, and his descendants settled in northeastern Africa in what became known as Egypt. And the Philistines are descendants of Mizraim's son, Casluhim. Canaan and another son of Mizraim settled, for the most part, in the land that God would later promise to Israel. Can someone read Genesis 9:26 for me?
And he said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant.
So Canaan's son Mizraim settled in the part that would later be the promised land. And we see that that actually happens. They became servants to the descendant of Shem. What role did God play in the Canaanites' decision to settle in what would become the promised land? Do you think God had a role? So we settled in the promised land. Why do you think that was? Do you think God had a plan for them to settle in the, what would be the promised land, and why? Well, it's a fulfillment of prophecy. Oh, go ahead, Carolyn.
I was thinking one thing would be, I mean, obviously God knows everything, but as the Israelites came in and eventually conquered those people groups,
Mm-hmm.
it gave them some resources and some wealth that they didn't have previously in Egypt. So there's provision for Israel as they were moving in. God was going to provide them with the resources they needed to survive that way.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Provided resources. I think it's a fulfillment of prophecy. One thing we want to remember about prophecy is, yes, we can determine the future from prophecy, or it can be surmised what's going to happen. But the most important thing about prophecy we want to remember is that it's there to glorify God when what God says comes to pass. So just remember that. Keep our proper perspective about prophecy. It's about glorifying God when what he says will happen comes to pass. So God sovereignly directed the descendants of Canaan to settle in the promised land. The Canaanites believed they were making their own decision when they settled there, but they did not know centuries later that their descendants would be invaded by the descendants of Shem. The descendants of Ham ended up being evil and powerful people, right? If you know your story about the conquest of the promised land, you know these people were evil people. Can someone please read Joshua 23, 11 through 13 for me?
Joshua 23.
Yeah, Joshua 23, 11 through 13.
Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant, these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them, so that you associate with them, and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you.
So with what we just read, why did God allow the descendants of Ham to become so powerful and so evil? I think it's that he could show his own power by defeating them, and so he could sovereignly use them to chasten Israel when they disobeyed. Because we see these people, the descendants of Ham, have been used to discipline Israel, right? We saw that with Babylon's invasion of Judah, and the people came back, but we also saw when the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom, Israel, completely wiped them off the map. They didn't even come back. So God can use the evilness of these people to discipline his people. And Israel's enemies have always served a purpose in God's plan. They thought they were acting independently to oppose God's people, but God was the one working behind the scene. God, in essence, set the table for Israel's history by sending the nations to strategic locations where they would multiply and be ready to be used in his dealings with Israel. Is God still working in the affairs of the world today? We see that he's working in the affairs. I mean, the world has gone kind of crazy right now, right? But if you look at the book of Daniel, we see that that God is working in the affairs of nations through the prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation. And these books have laid out the nations where they will be located. In the book of Daniel, it lays out where these nations will be located, and we see that today. So, all of this was planned back in Genesis 10 with the Table of Nations, right? And we see that working out today. Okay, looking at the descendants of Shem, 5 sons of Shem are listed in the Table of Nations, notably Asher in 1022 and his descendants settled in Assyria. They apparently lived in cities founded by Nimrod. As I mentioned earlier, Ham and Shem's descendants kind of mingled together. Peleg, the great-great-grandson of Shem, is the other notable descendant of Shem, and his name means division. It was during the days of Peleg that they say that the Tower of Babel happened. What happened in the Tower of Babel with the people? They were divided, right? So the people were divided in the days of Peleg. Now, I saw some other scholars as I was researching this say that there may have been catastrophic things happening on the earth at that time. And so, you guys have heard the idea of Pangea, right? Where all the world was together at one time. And a lot of people will use the flood to say that's when God separated the continents. Some of these scholars believe that that also happened some more during the days of Peleg. And that's what they mean by division. So there's 2 schools of thought on what division means. Division of the people or further separation of the continents. I tend to think it's division of the people with the Tower of Babel. But I just want you to know there's other good scholars out there that believe that the continents were continuing to spread. Let's go on here. The children of Eber comprised many different groups among the sons of Shem. The name Eber has been associated with the word Hebrew, the name by which the Israelites were known by other people. They were the ones who possessed the knowledge of the true God. You know, the term Hebrew is a racial term, while Israelite is a national term, right? Hebrew is a racial term, Israelite is a national term. Although today, they're kind of used synonymously. What language do you think the world first spoke? What language do you think Adam and Eve spoke? Many scholars think it was Hebrew. I'm sorry, what's that? Human, yeah. Not that that matters, but that was in there. So Genesis 10, through the genealogy of Noah and his sons, establishes the Table of Nations and identifies the 70 nations born of Noah. I've got a book on Kindle that's like 500 pages. Haven't read it all, just skimmed through it. It talks about the Table of Nations and where they all came from. It's a pretty interesting book, so I would recommend you guys check that out. Kind of interesting to see where everybody came from. So moving on to the next section, and we're looking at the spreading of the nations. In passage 1 through 9 of chapter 11, it explains how the nations came to be scattered across the face of the ancient world. It is a message of judgment. What they prided themselves in became their downfall, and what they feared the most came to them. So in the first 4 verses are called by the book the people's pride. Can some person please read verses 1 through 4? Or can someone please read? Some people. Can someone please read verse 1 through 4?
Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks, and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.
So the Tower of Babel account begins with the fact that the whole world had one language. So what do you think would be an advantage of the whole world having one language?
Being able to get things done.
Able to get things done? Communication? I mean, now I don't know, I'm not very tech savvy, but aren't there little devices you can have, maybe it's on your phone, an app where you can translate what somebody is saying right there on the spot? Helps with communication, doesn't it? Maybe the goal of the world or these tech companies is to have something like they had on Star Trek, a universal translator where it would just go right to your ear. I don't know. But imagine the ability to communicate if we all had one language. And that's the goal of the world right now, which is interesting.
It's interesting because when you think about the NATO, all these countries come together and they're all wearing earpieces. Person speaking in one language, but everybody that's there hears it in their own language.
Yeah.
It's all
You're talking about at the UN when they,
Right.
yeah, at the UN they do that, right? So that seems to be the goal of the world today, which maybe should put up a little red flag, as mankind is attempting to reaccomplish something that had been taken away some time ago. Also, I think in the case of someone like Nimrod, couldn't he control and motivate people if they were all of the same language? What kind of technology would the Antichrist need to motivate the whole world? AI, yeah. Or at least the ability to communicate to everybody, right? So we know that's where we're headed. Ideas and propaganda could be spread more easily if everybody had the same language. Joint projects and goals could be completed effectively and efficiently. How about worship of a deity? That could be easily become more uniform among the world if everybody spoke the same language, right? And there'd be a lot less social barriers to overcome if we all spoke the same language. So the universal language at the Tower of Babel or at Babel was doing what we would expect it to do. It was bringing people together for a common goal. That goal, however, was not godly. We know that. They weren't doing what God told them to do. It had violated God's directive to fill the earth back in Genesis 9:1. The people of the earth journeyed to Shinar and settled there. And that's in verse 11:2. And Shinar is where Nimrod built part of his kingdom, and that we see that in verse 10. So what are the sins of those people dwelling in Shinar? It seems to be mostly pride, right? Immeasurable pride. They said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. So this was open rebellion against God.
Well, then you have to go on and see what it says, lest we be scattered.
Right.
In other words, God says to scatter, but let's not scatter.
We're not going to do it, right? Humility is often equated with trust and obedience, and conversely, pride is related to independence and disobedience, right? So that's what we're seeing here. Here the people came together to strengthen themselves, and in pride to make a reputation for themselves, lest they be scattered over the whole earth, which is obviously in direct opposition to what God said. We already see a repeat of the conditions that existed before the flood, right? How long was it between the flood and Tower of Babel? What do you guys think? Good guess. Scholars believe 100 to 200 years.
I would think it was after Noah, I mean, he lived 350 years after.
Not necessarily. A lot of people think that Noah was still alive. They think that Ham was still alive, Shem and Japheth. A lot of them think all of them were still alive, and yet they were rebelling, having that remembered history of the flood. So they're saying they were already rebelling, having that memory. So like the pre-flood generation, the descendants of Noah saw no reason to honor God. And instead of honoring him, they honor themselves. You know what's interesting about the lifespans? And it makes me think, when we think that maybe Noah had passed away before this event, the length of lifespans means that Adam may very well have been a contemporary of his great-great-great-great-great-grandchild. We don't see that today because lifespans are so much shorter. I've seen some scholars who believe that Abram was a contemporary of Nimrod, and so were Abram's sons, because people were still living a long time back then. I don't know if that's true, but it's interesting to think of long lifespans and how that might make them contemporaries of other people that we think may have long been dead.
Chris, if you're saying 100 or 200 years potentially, how did the world get so many people? I mean, they must have bred like rabbits.
Well,
It's hard to comprehend that.
it is, but I mean, they obviously reproduced, they just didn't resettle.
Well, you gotta figure how many years, 900-something years, I mean.
Now, I'm not dogmatic about 100 to 200 years, but most of the research I saw said 100 to 200 years.
Even 500 years, I mean, the big cities in different parts of the world. A city is more than 10 people, and there's a lot of people.
Right. A lot of people were there. So I'm not dogmatic about 100 to 200 years, but like I said, that's what a lot of what I read was saying. So they want to make a name for themselves. They reason that constructing a metropolis and a skyscraper, they could achieve that glory. Looking at Genesis 11, 3 and 4, if you look at that, what parallels do you see between the attitude that motivated the building of the Tower of Babel and the attitudes that prevail in our society today? Yes.
Let us, make us, let us, us.
Yeah, very much so. What's that?
They had eye problems.
They had eye problems, yeah. They had eye problems. No, they were humanistic in their attitude, right? They were centrally focused on themselves. In that, they had a denial of the true God. And they had the belief that one has the right to determine what is right and wrong. We have a right to determine some of our actions, but we don't have a right to determine what is right and wrong, right? Society will tell you we do because truth is relative. So the builders' towers directly rebelled against God's desires. So they were driven by their own ambition. Apparently, they believed they would be successful and that God would be exposed as weak and unauthoritative. According to some scholars, the Tower of Babel could have been a religious temple, a ziggurat. Have you guys ever seen a picture of a ziggurat? I've got one here for you guys here in a second. With a platform at the top from which the builders could worship the stars instead of their true God. Others have different opinions about the Tower of Babel, what it was for, and for what purpose it was built. So here's what a ziggurat looks like. And this is modern day Iraq, and that's a ziggurat of Ur. So some scholars believe that that's the type of tower they were building. And so many scholars believe that was probably modeled after the Tower of Babel. What do you guys think about that? A lot shorter than you expected, right? Just want you to know that's what some scholars believe.
That may have just been the start of what
I'm sorry?
that may have just been the start of what they were planning if they wanted to reach into the heavens and God confused their language before
Right.
they got much.
So they could have gotten much higher than that. I agree with you. I personally don't believe that that's what they meant by the Tower of Babel. But many scholars do, because when you go back into archaeology, you find a lot of those. So you say they think those are to mimic the Tower of Babel. The heavens were important to the people of Babel, and their tower connected them with the stars and provided a high place of worship for their gods, so they could rebel against the one true God. The ambition of the tower builders to make a name for themselves was evident in their religion. They wanted power to create their own gods, and they did not want to be answerable to the Creator. Romans 1:18 through 20 says, "For the wrath of man is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse." So what message do the heavens communicate? Well, they reveal God's power, his eternal power and divine nature. So moving on to what the Tower of Babel might have looked like, we'll read Psalms 119 again. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. So how effectively do the heavens communicate God's glory? Perfectly, right? So the truth is that no one can be excused from not knowing God, because God reveals himself in his creation. David even said that there is no language in which the Creator's voice is not heard. So those at Babel could read the message of God's glory in the heavens, no matter what language they spoke. But instead of seeking to know the Creator, they suppressed what they knew of him and worshiped the creation. So now, I'm going from my iPad, so some things are a little bit jumbled up. But now, let's look at God's judgment. Well, you know what? Okay, well, we'll get to it. It's just different how I remember writing it. So can someone read Genesis 11, 5 through 9?
And the Lord came down to see the city of the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth. And they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth.
So the Tower of Babel is what made God see indeed the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they began to do. Now nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them. Does that picture and that ziggurat make you think that God sees that and says, oh my gosh, look at what they're building. Now nothing will be withheld from them. Does that make you feel that way? It doesn't me, I got to say. We know that Cain built a city after he was banished, right? He built a whole city. It seems odd that God would come down and see this and say, oh, look, the people are speaking one language, and look at this tower they're building. Nothing can be withheld from them. Does that seem odd language for a building like this? It does. At least it does to me. So we're going to look at this. So this right here is a painting by Peter Bruegel. It was painted in 1563 and has probably become the most famous depiction of the Tower of Babel. Have you guys seen that? You guys not seen that before? I've seen it throughout literature and pictures and stuff. So he painted that as a depiction of what the Tower of Babel might be. I think even that is small. How tall was the Tower of Babel? So those of you who know me know I like the Dead Sea Scrolls. I like looking at those. They're pseudepigraphical texts, meaning the Bible was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there's a lot of other texts that they thought were important enough to save. Among those were fragments of the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees is obviously not canonized and not inspired. So if we are going to refer to pseudepigraphical, I can't even say that word, writing, we need to be careful. However, the Essenes who hid these pots filled with these scrolls, obviously esteemed these pseudegraphical texts and works enough that they included them with Old Testament scrolls. Additionally, the apostles quoted from some of the pseudegraphical texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I mention this because there's a description of the Tower of Babel which can be found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Book of Jubilees. And I'm going to read that for you. It's Jubilees 10, 19 through 21. And it says, so, for they departed from the land of Ararat eastward to Shinar, for in his days they built the city and the tower, saying, go to, let us ascend into heaven. And they began to build. And in the 4th week they made brick with fire, and the brick served them for stone. And the clay which they cemented them together was asphalt, which came out of the sea and out of the fountains of the water in the land of Shinar. And they built it. 43 years were they building it. And its breadth was 203 bricks, and the height of a brick was the third of one, and its height amounted to 5,433 cubits and 2 palms. And the extent of the wall was 13 stades, and of the other 30 stades. So you have a structure that's tall and it's got long walls. So according to the Book of Jubilees, the height of the Tower of Babel was 5,433 cubits and 2 palms. This translates to roughly 8,150 feet, or about 1.5 miles high. Do you see that building right there next to it to the right? That's Burj Khalifa, whatever. That's the tallest building in the world today. That's what it looks like. So that's a tall building. And as far as the stadia that it talks about, 30 stades, they think that could be 200 miles was the base of this tower. Could have been huge. Now, I'm not here to tell you what you should think about the Tower of Babel, and I'm not dogmatic about any of it. But when I think of God coming down and saying, man has one language and he can do anything, I think more of that tower than I do of a little ziggurat. Just saying.
You know, our Tower of Babel today is the internet. I can post something out there and everybody in the world can read it in their own language.
Yep.
And verse 8, where it said, verse 6, and nothing that the proposed will do will now be impossible. You know, pretty much with the exception of creating life, man can do almost anything he wants to do.
Yep. It's very true. So regardless of what size the Tower of Babel was, God was not impressed with the man-made structure. And another thing we want to remember is God came down to see it. Thing's 1.5 miles tall, if that's the case, and God still had to come down to see it.
I find it interesting that God waited 40 years to shut him down.
Yeah.
Build and work, and then said, no.
Right? You know, that to me leads to God's mercy and grace. Giving them opportunity to repent from what they were doing. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, but we see so many places in the Bible where God shows his grace and his long suffering through time. I don't know if that's the case here, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Chris, is there any ruins or anything today that might indicate where it was? Have they found any?
I don't know if there's any ruins. However, when I was doing my research, they had a quote from another section in Jubilees and another quote from the Bible where it talks about the foundation being destroyed. I'd have to find that for you. But in any case, if it's 200 miles wide on each of the sides, we might even miss it as the base, but as a mountain. Does that make sense? I mean, who knows what it would look like today?
Yeah, with the bricks being
Yeah.
clay or dirt, whatever.
Well, with it being so long ago,
Yeah,
that,
and the rain just sort of washed it out like a big.
yeah. So, like I said, obviously, it's not the size that drew God to the scene. It was the wickedness, people's wickedness and pride that captured God's attention. And he knew that the Tower of Babel and the city of Babylon were just the beginning of the people's rebellion against him. God saw the world headed for the same evil seen in the pre-flood world, and he did not, if he did not do something to break up their unity. So that's what would have happened. Man would have continued to become sinful, and we would have seen the same situation. Genesis 11:6 tells us, "And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they began to do. Now, nothing that they proposed would be withheld from them." What are some severe judgments God could have justly brought upon the people? So here you've got this happening. What's some other severe judgments God could have justifiably done?
Could have caused a great earthquake to destroy that building and everything and everyone in it and around it.
He could have? Absolutely. I mean, he would have been justified, God would have been justified to probably destroy the whole world again, right? I mean, some other way than the flood. I think God could have been justified in anything he wanted to do with this level of rebellion. Do you think the inhabitants of Babel were foolish for defying God by building a city and a tower? Oh, we got to wrap it up, don't we? Yeah, we're going to have to wrap it up. I didn't finish everything, at least according to the book, but we'll pretend that I did. Let's see if there's anything that I want to... I have my little timekeeper over there. She's spinning her finger like, wrap it up. We'll just say that today's lesson completes the first major section of the book of Genesis. Next week, we're going to start looking at the last part of Genesis, starting in 12 through chapters 50. And that section is about the patriarchs of Israel. So we're going to see that starts with Abram and goes through Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So that's where we're going to go next week. Any questions before we break? No? Okay. Steve, do you mind closing us in prayer? Oh. What? What did I say? I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Let's close in prayer. Thanks.
Lord God, just thank you so much for the study we have right now this morning. It's all that we have to chance to get together and try to understand more of His Word, more of Your Word, and Your desire for us. It's all for glory for You. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.